All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get started with another episode of Prototype. Did you know we're on to episode 16? And did you know that's four more than by the way? And did you know that by default you can only select by the way number of units within StarCraft? Until now. Oh, shit. Oh, my God. How does he keep winning? He keeps winning. He doesn't stop winning. Well, guys, let me tell you. It's because I know a guy named Darkened Fantasies. And as absolutely ridiculous as that name is to type out every time I want to credit him, to the point where I've started to credit him as just DF, and hopefully everybody knows that, and his username won't even fit in the tournament feed for when I'm actually writing like names inside the overlays and stuff. Yeah, despite all of that, he's still a pretty cool guy. Did you know that? And did you know that he's fucking epic and man-moded the selection extender? Yeah, I bet you did know that, because who doesn't know that we've achieved 252 maximum unit selection? That exact number is silly. Don't ask me to explain it. DF can actually explain it for you if you want. You can join the server, yell at him, say, hey, well, why is it 252? Why exactly is it 252? You can ask him, dude. Don't ask me. But what I can tell you is that we will eventually try to go beyond that. I remember that apparently StarCraft 2's limit is 500. I think I pulled that number off in my head when it was being discussed earlier in the server. And yeah, it would be nice to actually say that we have more than StarCraft 2. Not that you can patrol 500 units across the map or whatever anyway, but in StarCraft 2 it's people say, "Oh my god, look, it's cutting edge." And like meanwhile, we just casually continue to improve the game that we have to the point where it is more feature complete. But I guess that's not that hard. It still is a funny little anecdote to say, we have less limited selection than StarCraft 2. Right now, not the case. 252, though, a huge jump up from 12, by the way. And that is a pretty big achievement. So the screenshot that you're seeing comes from the forthcoming Terran tutorial, the first mission for that anyway, because I think there's going to be a series of missions each. But I might start with one mission per race or something for now, or at the very least get like a Terran one and a Zerg one done, because Protoss obviously has this pending macro change that who knows how long is going to take to fully implement. So we might at least have like a Terran one and a Zerg one so people can get started. Maybe it's even worth making a single one-off Protoss one for the current model, as long as I recognize that it's not going to be supremely significant or whatever. And I think in all of these tutorials, I am planning on doing some some micro mirror matchups. That's what I meant to say. I was thinking macro revision, and then I was thinking micro, and then I was like, wait, no, we're not doing micro missions. We're not StarCraft 1 or 2. But what we are doing is we're going to make these tutorials. These tutorials are actually going to compete with the player, and I'll have more to say on that later. But I wanted to point that out because this is being developed, and the fact that you are going to be at such a high scale of units now, and we have been at that scale for a long while now, definitely means that the selection extender is a pretty big deal. Not just for general features, but also for game balance, because suddenly, Legionnaire swarms, legions of Legionnaires, for example, for Protoss, obviously anything from Zerg, but particularly Quasrock in the early game, and, Sovraleths later on, and all of this other stuff. Pretty big deal. And of course, Terran Bio. Suddenly I feel like these playstyles are going to get a bit of a jump up in terms of utility. I guess flyers, like swarms of flyers, will also become a lot more powerful in that context. I imagine in FFAs, in particular, you're probably going to see that, just like oceans of Sundogs and whatnot. I've already seen that from Mystery Meat anyway before the selection extender, so I'm sure he's happy about that particular aspect. And yeah, so, there's a lot of really exciting things to talk about in this episode. It's not just selection, it's also going to be the tutorials. So now that we've broached those initial subjects, let's talk a little bit about what else we're going to be doing in the wake of such an incredible change and achievement. So I guess the burning question on a lot of people's minds when we first did achieve the selection extender, which was actually right before we started group play for Ascension 3 this past Saturday, was what are playoffs going to be played on? And they will still be played on release. We will still push the selection extender to release after a little bit more testing and a couple of additional changes to the feature set, but also, most crucially, we need to make sure that we successfully smash out a bunch of changes to, prevent release from being smashed in terms of meta. Because like I said, there's going to be a lot of balancing considerations here. So Ascension number 3 playoffs, which will be taking place, it looks like right now, Friday and Saturday of this week. So coming up pretty soon here, of course, this is being recorded on a Wednesday. The other thing to note is that a week after that, we will not be doing Ascension 4 immediately. We will be doing a Fraud Night and a little bit more laid back game night, basically, where We mostly play like team games or versus AI if there's lower numbers of players at the start or at the end or whatever. It'll probably go for about 3 hours is my guess. We start at 3 p.m. Eastern, so that is actually the same time as the start time for the first groups of all of the tournaments so far. So that's somewhat helpful and interesting and something that we should definitely try to do, I think. Going forward is wrinkle in a couple of those every now and then, right? Sprinkle them in, I should say. Wrinkle is not really a verb per se, but I guess you could de-wrinkle something. So we'll de-wrinkle the schedule by adding fraud nights. And beyond that, we might end up going in general for the idea that Ascension turns into a once a month type of deal, where maybe that allows us to have, something like 4 groups where, one Saturday is the first set of groups and another Saturday is the second set of groups and then the third Saturday is playoffs or whatever. Something like that could work conceivably. The big thing that people have been asking is like, well, why can't we just do Sundays? And as I mentioned in the server, I work Sundays. I work almost every Sunday. You do get that time and a half pay over here. So it ends up being a pretty significant chunk of change for me. I think I did the math out, and if I received $200 a week, so a total of $800 a month, which for coffee is actually $1,600 because I obviously share half of that with Veek anyway, then at that point I could pretty comfortably take Sundays off in perpetuity. But then we did some more math, and it would require like 354 people or something like that donating $3. So, hey, if you watch this and you want to donate $3 a month, well, you know where to go. But ultimately, that is not a realistic thing to achieve anytime soon. So we just have to kind of work within people's schedules as a result. Some people work on Sundays also in the server, so I imagine, I'm not even sure Sundays would always work as a guarantee anyway. But that would theoretically allow us, if we have enough, if we have only, between 2 and 3 groups, basically, if we have that number of groups on a Saturday, then on a Sunday, we could theoretically do playoffs immediately or something to that effect, basically the next day, if people were available. I'm not even sure that people would be available, but that is the very, very lofty goal if we want to actually make that happen with some degree of regularity, because most of the time I'm working on Sundays. So if that changes for a weekend or whatever, then that's fine. I can mention that to the guys, and everybody can plan around that or whatever. Maybe we can do the playoffs a day after, which would certainly be better in general. People have also talked, are we going to be like getting an Ascension specific branch of the pre-release or release or whatever, like a third option? No, because it would actually require, for one, each version of CMBW I think is about 1 gigabyte right now. So I wouldn't really want to take up yet another gigabyte of people's disk space, because actually for some of the people who play CMBW, I think that would be not a huge issue, but like, an unnecessary, really, I have to do this. The other thing is, it would require redistributing the fraud launcher, which at this stage feels like it would be a little bit silly to do, because we do have probably in the order of about 100 players. A lot of them are going to be offline. They don't like play, or they play co-op like by themselves or whatever. They don't play with people on the server or whatever. And then obviously there's like the 20, 30 or so people who do play on the server somewhat frequently. So like, I guess it's probably closer to 20, not 30. But, whatever, somewhere in that range. So I would really hate for all of those active players who already know how to use the current fraud launcher to be like, oh, yeah, by the way, you guys have to re-download it or whatever. That seems a little silly. But anyhow, that is something that I have been thinking about as far as how to wrangle things. Another thing I was thinking about recently is I should probably add a role to the server for like Cosmonarchy Brood War announcements, because then I can mention stuff like, we have achieved the selection extender, for example, or hey, we're going to be doing, a community night, like instead of a tournament, we're going to do a fraud night this day or whatever. Just so that people who want to be in the know for those announcements, but are a little bit more on the lurk side of things or whatever, can self-assign that role using the channels and roles thing on Discord. And then, I can start to ping people about that. I can add that to like the welcome wagon shit or whatever as well, for new people who just want to join and aren't sure what's going on. So that might help, especially with some of the lurkers who to be a little bit more attuned, because maybe they don't bother messaging a lot of the time or reading a lot of the messages. That was something I was thinking about in general. And yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, some people were just joining and were like, "Oh, I really wish we could have the extended selection," and and then we did. So I don't know. I don't want to set the wrong kind of example because that's a pretty big ask as far as like a technical requirement. So the idea that like I wouldn't want somebody to get the wrong idea, like, "Oh, I guess these guys can just instantly deliver on any request I have," like or whatever. It wasn't a small task. So again, DF a real man for that. But that's sort of the update anyway on event scheduling. Obviously, taking a week off here is going to be a really big deal for balancing out the game in general. Also, stress testing the extender a little bit more, particularly in multiplayer, making sure that we're not potentially causing issues or what have you. And as of right now, yeah, like I said, the limit is 252. We're still easing out on some changes here and there as far as again, just stress testing things and improving things. So obviously, if you run into any issues, report them in the right spot. But ultimately, we are in a pretty good position, I think, to fairly comfortably move on forward with the idea that, yeah, this is going to be the new reality. Yes, we will have extended selection. And yes, Ascension 4 will be played with it. Of course, the playoffs are not going to be played with it because that would absolutely break the meta, I feel like. Or at least it would change radically what is possible with the average player. It's sort of like, in some cases, players get like 1,000% better at unit control because they can just order their entire army to go somewhere or whatever. Now, in practice, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. But I do feel like this could have a very significant effect. And particularly will allow players to change their strategies a bit more to start using Quasrock or start using Mass Bio or whatever. I mean, Benno, for example, doesn't care too much about like whether or not there's a selection limit for that kind of thing. However, in the context of, everybody else, like I have a feeling that things would change pretty radically. So, who knows? We'll see what happens. But for now, yes, indeed. Extended selection? No, indeed. We will not be playing with it on Ascension 3 playoffs. And yeah, we're going to be having some pretty good fun doing some more runs. I think before this coming Fraudarchy, which is the 6th of August, we will probably attempt a couple of stress tests to try to track down some desyncs that we think still exist anyway. It's been a while since they've been reported. And if we can do that in an FFA context and we can get some data on like what could be causing it, then that will at least inform us of where we can go. And unfortunately, it does require a bunch of other actual people to be playing the game. It's not just something that the devs can do on their own, at least with any degree of reliability. So we'll probably start off with everybody playing Terran and everybody only being allowed to build stockade units and static defense and, tech up or whatever as well. And like, all right, let's just try to like throw Mavericks at each other basically, or like, other units out of the stockade. Eventually, maybe you graduate to like, Atlas or Anvil and Morningstar and stuff with the Eidolon. I don't know, like everything out of the stockade is viable, is enabled, is allowed. And maybe over time we can start to think of it like, okay, well, hey, we're not getting any desyncs yet, so let's start throwing in other units and like just keep an account of everything that you made and all that stuff. So I feel like that could help us track down some of these problems, and I would really like to achieve that. So it is going to be somewhat difficult to confirm, but it is something that I want to make some progress on because I do think FFAs in CMBW would be absolutely phenomenal. So looking forward to achieving that. Now, that being said, there's a couple of other things that I wanted to cover here, and those are balancing considerations that I'll be tackling just before Ascension 4, essentially. So obviously we need to evaluate certain things after the selection extender. But in general, I would really like to see, not just how players are adapting to it, but there's certain things that I think need to be adjusted anyway. Particularly Tier 2 and beyond, there are some outlier units that should be somewhat revised, or at least like, stat passed or something, just to see what's going on. See if there's any evaluations that need to be done there. I was thinking that maybe Zoriusthaleths are actually a little bit too durable since they're at 220 health with 3 armor, but what I might end up doing is just like leaving them as is and just like letting that as a suggestion sink in, and then maybe I'll see confirming or denying, sort of supporting evidence or whatever for either side of that. And the other thing that is definitely going to be in my sights is a Cyclops revision. I came up with the idea that they could have some sort of area denial where the mark that they leave on an enemy when they attack takes a little bit longer but to actually proc, but also stays in place wherever the thing hits. So it's more effective in that context against buildings. That probably means that their attack rate is going to go up. Their attack cooldown will go up, which means they'll attack slower. But that way it'll match the longer detonation time, right? And it'll probably be a projectile. And so my context is, it might even be an intercepting projectile where like you can block it with some other unit. But my context anyway is the idea that if you can do something like that, suddenly there's this really innate synergy with lobotomy mines where the vultures can lay those. And then on top of that, you end up having, the stun plus the slow means it's harder to get out of the field that triggers the damage or whatever. And, it's an effect field, so it would probably deal full damage no matter what. It wouldn't have a fall off or whatever, is my thinking. And so, that would probably happen. I feel like that sort of area denial thing in a light way, without dealing a crazy amount of damage, it still allows me to bump up the power of the thing because now there's more counterplay to it, and obviously increases its power versus structures or immobile units or units which are stunned by some other means, which is again where the vulture synergy happens. I feel like that would be really cool. I think there are a couple of other things that were under my consideration. I do feel like we could probably have, I can't remember if it was at tier 1, but there was something that I was thinking about that I've now forgotten the specifics for, that I felt like it would be good to have some kind of slow effect for some kind of on-hit behavior or something. But I think I wanted it to be kind of interesting. Like, there's this behavior with the Kelvin munitions for the Claymore, where the attack pierces with kinetic penetration, and pierced units in particular are the ones that are receiving the slow. So the original target may also receive the slow, but that's a separate thing. So I think that would be really cool, but ultimately I'm not 100% sure if we can realistically apply that. And I know I also wanted to try a slower attack rate or projectile speed specifically for the Cyprian. So the attack rate would actually be unchanged. It was just me misspeaking. The Cyprian would fire its projectile, and the projectile itself would move a little bit slower. And that means that when you're at the maximum range of the Cyprian, in particular in, anchors, because the range is longer, therefore the travel time is longer, you could see a world where you can more easily kite at the outskirts and maybe even in the mid range if you have a really fast unit. I feel like that would work out pretty well. So that's something that I'm definitely thinking about doing. So the tier 1 changes are Cyprian, projectile speed, some kind of slow for something. I can't remember what race it was even for. I think it was for either Zerg or Protoss. I don't think it was for Terran. And then obviously the change to the Cyprian or the Cyclops as well. So basically, most of the changes are related to Terran, and then I have to figure out what unit I was thinking about applying a slow to. I'm not sure. I'm honestly not sure about that one. There's also a couple of other bugs that I want to fix. One of them being the pernicious hold position bug, but now I have a really surefire way to reproduce it, which I'm not going to say here because I don't think anybody in the tournament would do this, but I would hate for people in the tournament to start abusing it because they figured out how to do it deliberately. I don't even want that to be in their minds as a thing that they have to weigh up and then dismiss because they're honorable people. It's easier if they just don't know it. But for those who do know, yes, that bug is still there, and I do need to resolve it, and I have a way to do it, or at least I have a lead, I know how to reproduce it. So we'll investigate that. And then there's also the max range bug with hippogriffs in particular that seems to... that seems like maybe it's not even a max range thing, and it's something in the weapon configuration that's dealing splash damage or something, and thus it overrides the guaranteed hit. I think maybe something like that is happening, so I'll have to take a look. Because obviously the hippogriff, when you have prolonged arms or kinetic pen or whatever, you're supposed to rely on that for your crowd control, your splash damage or whatever. So I'm guaranteeing you that's actually what the problem is. So anyway, I'm going to look into fixing that. There's particular units that miss at max range, and I think the hippogriff is the most immediately applicable one. I don't think I've seen that recently with Cyprians or Sentinels, or really anything else that has max range. But of course, if somebody has a report to counter this claim, feel free to submit it. So some bug fixes. Mostly, it's going to be a lot of balancing for the tier 2 space, particularly, just basically the later in the tech tree you go, the more untested a lot of units and interactions in particular are, which is why it took us until a tournament to actually see Zarkava cores being so obviously bugged. It's just nobody's made that unit in a long time, and it was the product of some revision or refactor or whatever that, or maybe it was always broken, but I really don't think so because I tested that unit a lot when I was first implementing it. So I think that particular passive has been re-implemented, I think 3 or 4 times already, just because the code underneath the hood was really arduous to make work properly. And so Veek went through a number of revisions to the different functions and stuff. So as a result, I'm not surprised that there was something broken with it. And I'm also not surprised it took us so long to find it. So there you go. Beyond that, what else was there? There's a couple of other things that are like that. I don't know about the balance of certain units. I don't know about the performance of certain units. Like maybe certain units are weaker than they should be, and maybe I think that's actually more often the case that units are weaker than they ought to be, or somewhat underwhelming or whatever, just because we haven't gotten around to it. And actually, the more I think about that slow effect, I think I was thinking of the Teth Zorikor. I was planning on making it slow or something. But I might do some other sort of wacky status effect. We'll see. I maybe was thinking of adding more armor rends to Zerg at some point, but I actually don't know about that one. We'll see. We'll see about that one because I'm interested in continuing to play around with things like that for sure. I want to say, other than that, obviously we are continuing to progress towards a more feature-complete game with the selection changes and the wireframe changes to go along with them. I don't know if we will extend the number of wireframes specifically. That's something that Fagudo has been requesting, as that's something that Burning Ground did. I'm actually not sure that it would not be too much info if you went it. I can't remember what max number they hit. I think it was like 30 or something. Maybe we can do like 18 or something different. Currently, basically, the way that it works is once you exceed 12 units, your selections get collapsed into like of a certain type. So if you have 12 Zethicors and 5 Hydralisks, it will say, it'll show you 2 wireframes, but one of them will have a 12 next to it, and one of them will have a 5. So that's basically how we're handling that. And then you can click on the one unit type to select all of them, or you can like shift click it to deselect one at a time or whatever. Stuff like that. So that's useful for obvious reasons. However, it still does mean that if you ever select more than 12 unique unit types, then you will run out of space on the command card, or not the command card, the status info panel. So that's the kind of thing that we would obviously like to safeguard against. And you can't really safeguard against it completely because we can't add scrolling, and we're not going to make it so that you can select up to 100 unique units or something, or like show that many wireframes or whatever. I don't even know if that's possible, but certainly not something that we know how to do yet, and we wouldn't want to do it anyway. We would want to instigate some kind of scrolling mechanism, but who knows how to do that in Brood War? Like nobody, basically. I guess you could do maybe you could do pages. Maybe pages would be acceptable, but I still don't know if that's true. So it certainly seems more likely than scrolling anyway. But the other thing was I really wanted to achieve some kind of general mock-up, and I did make the mock-up, and that did inform how DF was able to make the wireframe grouping, so I'm very happy with that. But, in the mega late game, you may have armies that are more than, 12 unique unit types. And that does mean that, of course, we will still have a deficient UI for that. So we would obviously want to avoid something like that. But it's a lot better than it could have been if we didn't change the group wireframes at all. I'm really, really happy that DF was able to do that. And I think that just about wraps up our balancing considerations. Tournament scheduling we talked about, as well as, of course, the general overview of the selection extender. Again, we do want to go past 252, even though it's kind of unlikely to get to that point. We also want to make some improvements to the line rendering, because when you select that many units, it's pretty noisy, but we are not yet sure if that's feasible. Obviously, one of the methods that we did in Antikythera, which has a similar system, is we didn't draw the lines over the units, nor did we draw them at full opacity. So it was actually a lot easier to achieve some sort of readable look at a glance, and we just can't do opacity in Brood War, as far as I know, easily. Not easily for the GPU anyway. I mean, there is no GPU in Brood War. It's all software rendering. So that would tank performance a lot, I think. Beyond that, there's also obviously the whole sorting issue, or whatever, where they're drawn on top of the unit. I think it would be great if they were drawn underneath the unit. However, if they were, you might lose the line, or the origin of the line or whatever inside the unit. So maybe you could have like a dot on top of the unit or something, to indicate that unit was indeed following an order and had a line linked to it or something like that. I don't know. I'm not 100% sure how you would do it in a way that looks good, but you could maybe explore that as an idea. So we'll see. But yeah, aside from some UI related issues, and obviously you could just turn off order lines if you don't want them anyway, that is pretty much the only concern. All right, so yeah, like I said, that pretty much covers the selection extender section of the episode. So let's talk about the tutorial, which is the second part of this screenshot that you see here. This is in the context of an actual match, a tutorial map, if you will. I think the biggest problem right now with Cosmonarchy Brood War is that it's very dense insofar as it's difficult to penetrate, right? It's difficult to understand what the essence of the game is, particularly since it's a Brood War mod, and most people think it's going to be downstream of Brood War to some degree, which is not an ridiculous assumption to make, obviously, but it's just something that doesn't end up passing muster. There's a lot of things that are different, and a lot of those things are not immediately shown to the player, or, the player has to actually go through a series of, learning lessons, right? And it would be nice if we had some more official way and streamlined way of doing that, right? So I think the tutorials will, in a genuine sense, actually make the thing more accessible. And that is the first goal, right? The goal in general of the tutorial content is to introduce new players to each of Cosmonarchy Brood War's races. Also, it's to make it very clear that we are going to demand improvement from weaker players, even in the context of a tutorial, especially in the context of a campaign or single-player content in general. And so this is going to be a major focus for the tutorials. And it does follow in some ways from an answer to Three Crows' coffee question somewhat recently. I believe it was actually on the last episode I mentioned that it sort of gave him my thoughts on his 3-part tutorial proposal. And I think that will indeed be the Terran tutorial outline, because there will probably be more than one mission for each tutorial. And beyond that, there's a couple of other things to think about. These are all basically like micro in the sense of small scale, not in the sense of, low mission count. That's the sense that they are micro. I was going to say micro campaigns. Obviously, that doesn't mean that they have micro missions. It means that they're smaller, right? Smaller in scale and in scope than a conventional campaign. Day of Blood, obviously being a 6-mission campaign, is slightly larger than these 3-mission campaigns or 4-mission campaigns or whatever that are going to be used for the tutorial. But it's, still on the smaller end, in general, right? It's not like 10 or 12 or 15 or whatever some of the other campaigns are going to be. So anyway, all that said, when we're thinking of the Terran tutorial, we are going to be, by the way, for all these tutorials, you'll be playing as the default melee faction. So there will not be any sub-factions available. And I think for all the tutorials, they will be mirror matchups, as I mentioned earlier in this episode. I think what you'll find is by fighting against your opponent, at the very least in the first mission, maybe the things change up later on, in the context of I'm playing as Terran, if my opponent is also Terran, then I start to build this understanding that everything that this person does, I can also do. Every single thing that this AI throws at me, these are all tools that I have at my disposal as well. So if I see, wraiths, then I know, okay, I can build wraiths. And if I see some new unit like a Cyprian, okay, well, presumably I can build that too. And all of this stuff, anyway, is the main idea. So that will also allow me a unique, plot and world building exercise for me to sort of explore Chrysiliant, right, the sector that is so far away from the Caprulu section, and allows the setting to be so far removed from what we're used to from StarCraft, to the point where now I can basically kind of fanfiction and homebrew my own things that are going to be presumably a lot more interesting than the default content. And that goes for beyond gameplay stuff as well, but of course also for gameplay stuff. So, yeah, I actually don't suspect that new players, and particularly weak players, are going to be able to beat the tutorial in their first try. This is true for the current version of the Terran tutorial. I was playing a little bit lazily in the current build that I have, and not bothering to do any defensive work, not bothering to build any defenses, and I got shit stomped. So that was actually quite surprising, because it was the first time I was testing the new change. I was just spamming only Mavericks, basically, kind of doing a meme build almost. And as a result of that, I did indeed end up getting owned, which is promising, because it means that, a player who's very familiar with things, I think I was playing on a slightly faster than normal game speed for the purposes of testing, actually for the purposes of getting the screenshot, funnily enough. And, you get overwhelmed. Your enemies start to use higher tier units and etc. So you end up getting owned as a result, if you do silly stuff or if you just play poorly in general. And I was definitely doing both of those. So I definitely deserved to lose. And it's nice that the game actually did defeat me as a result. The enemy did actually earn victory over me in that context. So with that in mind, that's one of the things that you can definitely keep in mind as a goal for the project is this is going to, are there going to be some abuse cases? Will you be able to cheese the AI? Probably. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if you're able to cheese the AI in every one of these missions, in probably every single campaign mission for that matter, barring some examples where maybe there are actually going to be some pre-placed assets that prevent you from doing so. But in the early stages of all of the campaigns where everybody's starting off on relatively equal footing, I highly doubt that there won't be some sort of cheese strategy that somebody can develop to basically bypass the genuine levels of difficulty that come from the mid-game fights, or just past the first 5 minutes, basically, where the AI can somewhat stabilize, or becomes a little bit harder to just overthrow and usurp by doing some hyper-aggressive cheese strategy. And I think that's a pretty good move to think about in general. So with that being said, I'm not worried about the whole cheese thing. I think of it as, unfortunately, the AI is not very adaptable in that sense. I don't know if it ever will be for CMBW. It's kind of out of scope considering the level of power that we currently have over the AI specifically. Will some very easy ways get patched out at some point if they're found? Well, yeah. But, when I open this up to testing and to general play and people check it out and they're like, oh, I was able to do this really silly strategy. If it's oddly specific to the point where guarding against it would do more harm than to the average 99% of players who just play, seriously in air quotes, then I'm obviously not going to be doing that. So there's probably going to be certain things that you'll open up pathways, right? And the other thing is that since all of these maps are going to have, maybe some maps will be a little bit more freeform than others, but a decent number of the maps are going to be manually curated as far as the AI's build order and adaptation possibilities, basically manually handled through triggers and layouts and stuff, as well as their obviously their base layout. I kind of give the game away there. Since that's the case, they're all going to be curated. Maybe there's even going to be a randomization where it picks randomly from a set of different builds it can do at some point. The tutorials won't have that because they're meant to be a little bit more easy to replay. Although maybe the second and third missions of the tutorials can do that. The first mission will be very I always do the same thing kind of deal. At least in the early stages of the game. Obviously there's going to be variants afterwards where maybe in one playthrough you deny this base and in the other playthrough you don't. Therefore the AI has more things in this area, right? That's one example where it will be different. But generally speaking, you're going to get to the point where in the early stages, the first missions, for the people who are placing in playoffs at the Ascension level, you're probably not going to have too much difficulty with, the tutorial missions specifically, because they're not really for you. They're for players who don't even know that we call our Marines Mavericks, for example. That's the kind of target audience, if you will. But we're also challenging them to be better. I actually wouldn't be surprised if, say, maybe, I don't know, set players on the lower end of the Ascension competitive pool did actually have some challenge with some of them. I mean, obviously the AI technically does have certain inalienable advantages, not just the fact that they can micro forever and never get tired or tilted, but also the fact that they do indeed still have that 1.25x resource multiplier where, 4 minerals is actually 5, as an example. And they also have technically they know exactly where all of your structures and units are. So they don't know what they are, or they don't really react to the threat too intelligently. So it's not really they use this information very well, but that's default Brood War AI is they don't have a vision bank where they store everything that they've scouted. So they just know that, oh, the enemy has a structure here, or maybe they don't even know what unit type it is. I don't think they have any code to adapt to what unit ID it is, but they know the concentration of your forces and your structures. And that's so that they, presumably because they were really bad at adapting. I don't actually know why Blizzard decided to allow them to map hack and metagame, but they basically do that. So yeah, there's not, that doesn't mean that they'll respond to a cheese or a proxy very well at all. They will just know that, hey, there's a thing here. They might not even target it with their first military attack or something. So yeah, it's pretty stupid. That being said, anyway, the point is the AI will probably give some players a run for their money. You will still have to play an RTS to defeat them. It's just that for example, the first mission is very, they're hyper aggressive. They just want to attack you all the time. They're only really interested in just sending waves upon waves of tier 1 units, occasionally supported by in the late game tier 2 and tier 3 units. But for the most part, they stick to their captaincies. They have a small spattering of, obviously they have loads of stockades, a decent amount of captaincies, some fulcrums, some mantles, as well as some nanite assemblies. Those are kinds of the kinds of things that they make, but they're very particular about that sort of thing. They don't really deviate too much from the plan of just overwhelming you with sheer force and trying to defeat you as quickly as possible. So if the longer you can hold on, the better, right? But it's also going to really shock people, I think, when they scout the enemy's base to some degree by, say they end up building like wraiths or whatever, they figure out they can use wraiths to scout, or they just charge in and like start attacking an area, and maybe they make some progress and then they get driven back. When they lose, but they see like the sheer number of stockades that this guy's got or whatever, I'm really interested in what people's reactions are going to be like watching playthroughs of this sort of thing for people who are not initiated. Like imagining if, I'm trying to think of like content creators who do this, but like obviously Connor's a bad example because he's a reasonable player and he has played the project before. So I guess you could say like somebody like Jay Marino, or who's the other guy? I guess Loco was the other guy that was doing campaign playthroughs. I don't think he was doing custom content though. Anyway, somebody like that who could jump through and be like, hey, I'm going to play this thing because it's out and it's cool. Let's start with the tutorial. And then they're like, Jesus Christ, why do they have so many stockades or barracks? They'll probably just call them barracks, right? Because it's a more familiar term. Beyond that, right, when they look at that, I really wonder what they're going to think. Like, then maybe they're going to like send a unit out at the beginning of the game just to see what's going on. And then they'll see nothing. And they'll be like, holy shit, they actually build them over time or so. You know what I mean? Because like they're, I don't know how frequently they're going to scout. Most players who play campaign content don't ever scout because the enemy just has a lot of shit. So yeah, that's going to be really interesting. And I'm really excited to see how people's perceptions of RTS content sort of start to shift when they experience this sort of thing, where yes, even though there's a lot of flaws, it's cheesable, it's cheating, it's not very, intelligent as far as adaptations go. There's definitely some really obvious like fatal flaws in it. And in this particular case, it's actually designed to be a flawed enemy, where it's just it's like tired. The commander in lore is tired of training these failures of a cadet and like just smashing them. So he's just like, fuck it. Instead of a really long game, like a long simulation that I just played versus the previous guy, it's time for me to just start smashing. So that's what he does versus you. And that's like that's like explained by the briefing and stuff. So you're kind of led to believe that this guy is just trying to wipe you off the map very quickly. And that's totally acceptable in the context of what's happening in the story. So it makes sense to me. And I think that's a pretty good move. So with all that said, I do think the tutorials are going to be a great success at demonstrating that players can and will improve over time pretty markedly when they're challenged to. I don't think people are going to get hard stuck on this particular tutorial. I think odds are they're going to realize, hey, I should scout out and find some anchors, and hey, I should start doing this or that, and hey, I should tech up after getting enough Vespene, and Vespine's actually kind of hard to come by on this particular map, so I should like make sure that I branch out and expand as much as possible. And then I've got to like defend. So they can do this like slow crawl and like sort of explore the map and all that. And that's going to be a big deal for them. So yeah, with all that said, I think that will be beneficial as far as general implementation of how things are going to work out and setting the bar for, hey, if you're not good enough to beat these tutorials, then you should probably get good enough to beat these tutorials. And they're fairly stable in terms of the expected outcome of what the AI does. So rather than like, hey, I fought against, a rush this game, and then you expect a rush, but they actually greed fast expo, and then you're like, oh shit, now I'm behind because I built all this static defense. Like that could happen in maybe a later campaign mission or something, like in a proper mission where there's actual, like it's expecting you to be a veteran level player or something to whatever degree that, because that's like a meme within the StarCraft community, but genuinely doing that. Like, okay, in that context, let's start getting into the weeds. That makes a bit more sense. For the tutorials, I think I'll probably make it very stable, very consistent. And then it's just like, this is the bar. It's pretty much always the same, barring some, unintentional or incidental and thus not very significant variance that happens like later in the game or whatever. These are the initial conditions. They're always the same. The strategy is always the same to start with. The build order is always the same, etc. So see what you can do. Like jump in and do your best. And once you improve, you'll eventually pass that bar because it's, again, very static. So it might take you a few tries, but you'll do it. And then you'll be ready to go after a higher bar. And then ideally, I can design each mission to be increasing in scale and in scope, not just in difficulty. And that will be part of what makes it more difficult for the average player because they're still adjusting to this sort of thing. So increasing the number of things that they have to worry about and the number of enemies and obviously adding allies and stuff That is actually the number of factors that go up. That's going to be a significant factor in what is the difficulty for the player. So you start to learn crisis management. You start to learn, that what Day 9 says in one of his StarCraft intro series or whatever. I think this quote is really good. It's really applicable. It's StarCraft is being a military commander is hard, right? StarCraft is a hard game. Making it so that in Cosmonarchy Brood War content, you feel that being a military commander is hard is a top priority. And so even in the tutorials, we will stress that. And this is despite improving the UI, adding multi-building select, extending the selection most recently, all of this other stuff. We've made the game experience a lot better. We've made unit movement smoother. We've made order timers basically negligible so that units are more responsive. We've made the game more functional in a bare bones sense. And there's loads of things that we've improved for obviously, so when I said unit movements are smoother, I'm thinking Drakadin, Goliath, Ultra Core, Rillisk, stuff like that, or Rocore, I should say. There's units which move at varying paces that don't do that anymore. A Cantor would be another one. Obviously, Zethracore. We made it so that these units are more consistent. You're welcome. This improves the unit playthrough. It improves their pathing. It improves their performance, their handling, if you will. Obviously, we did the same thing with transports, right? Transports accelerate much faster now, so it's a lot harder to have them drift in the context of this unit is now less clunky, basically, is what we've achieved. Now, that's for the small transports. Obviously, the Pythian and the Othsteleth and stuff are a little bit different. But beyond that, it's okay, yeah, we have this access to this really cool stuff. This is something that we should be cognizant of as far as, these are epic things that you can rely on as far as, just in general. I think that's a big deal. That being said, that doesn't mean that the difficulty goes away, right? We believe the difficulty can come from competitive opponents and deep choices that you have to make where there is a decent amount of choice. And part of that depth comes from strategic stuff where you're deciding not just which units to build, but also how to approach fights and set up fights with them. And then there's the mechanistic side where you actually take the fights to begin with. So it's decision making, and then it's, can you do the actual clicking correctly and all that? These are all really big elements of the game. And we believe very strongly at the No Frauds Club that is a recipe for grand success. And so far, I think our ideas are boring out correctly, right? They're bearing out correctly, I should say. They have borne fruit. And that's pretty epic. So, I guess I'd say bore fruit. Man, I'm really fucking up some of the words today. I'm sorry about that, guys. Anyhow, this is the state that we're in, and I'm feeling pretty happy about that, words notwithstanding. So that is the tutorial rundown. That's obviously, I focused pretty heavily on the Terran stuff. The Protoss tutorial, I will almost certainly be working on after the Zerg tutorial, or at least I'm not really worried too much about it. So I guess some names to throw at you. The Terran tutorial is called Calling Card. I think Calling Card is really neat as a title because it's obviously, there's a lot of reasons why it's called that, and hopefully it will be apparent when you get in there. But I like the concept of that title. Anyway, it works out pretty well. The Protoss tutorial is going to be called The Pilgrimage, and I think there's lots of interesting things there. However, I'm a little bit miffed that obviously I'm referencing human history in their title. I mean, pilgrimage is technically just a word, but I don't know, I always associate that with the Mayflower and shit, the pilgrims from the old world coming over to North America. Obviously, in the grand scheme of things, pilgrim is just a word, so it probably is fine to use here. That's something that occasionally trips me up when I'm naming stuff. But that's imagining, you're sending off a new plucky, commander for the Protoss, right? A battle master or whatever we end up calling them. These are going to be an introduction into the way that the Divine Primacy works. I actually have a bunch of stuff figured out for this already in terms of their command structure. So it'll be a nice way to look into them. And, you'll be training against a fellow Protoss battlemaster, and the two of you will fight or whatever, and it'll be somewhat similar in that context to the Terran stuff. Meanwhile, the Zerg tutorial has the working title of Cosmosis, because I really like that. I came up with that a long time ago. I have talked about this before, but I have this Google Doc. I upgraded it in air quotes to a Google Doc because I wanted to share it with some people so they could also see what I was cooking. But basically, it's just called Power Text, and it's literally just an ocean of phrases and words and whatever sort of I forget the term for when you make an unofficial combination of two words. It's not concatenation. There's some word for it that I can't immediately think of. But anyway, that word is exactly what I like. I like those things. So actually, Cosmonarchy obviously came from that. So when I was thinking of Cosmonarchy, before it, I thought of Cosmosis. And it just sort of hit the back burner. And I was like, fuck yeah, dude, Cosmosis. Because you learn by osmosis, you know? And it's like a cellular type of deal that happens, right? I mean, it's related to water. So it's not really, it's molecular in nature. And then obviously is the prefix for cosmos, etc. So Cosmosis, I think, is pretty epic. Might be a little bit funny, similar to the Future Station, you know? But either way, it's pretty neat. So that being said, I think we've pretty much covered all of that. I mean, the names are just like little teasers. I don't have exact things figured out for what's going to happen in each one of them. The Terran is the most well along. The Protoss, I have ideas for the command structure. The Zerg, well, it'll be a cute way for me to explore the presentation of Zerg, because I was planning I should probably plan a campaign to do that. But now I can just use the tutorial for that. So that'll be nice. And you'll be fighting against live Zerg as opposed to, training simulation stuff for the Terran and Protoss. So I think that'll be neat. The other thing I'm not sure about is, will I assume that you've played the Terran tutorial before the Protoss tutorial and the Protoss tutorial before the Zerg tutorial? Well, I can't really assume the last one because the Zerg tutorial is going to come out first. So I might end up with a dialogue and such. At least, I mean, maybe you should play the Terran tutorial first because it also helps to really easily explain certain things like the resources. Like they just sort of mention it to each other. Your protagonist character mentions, are there any geysers anywhere? Like, why do I only have 2 ridges? Basically, is like he has an in-universe version of that. But he's like basically complaining about the lack of geysers, and that's a much better way to do it than say, what is this thing called a Vespine Ridge? Because the player will just harvest it and then figure it out. So I'm not really too worried about that. But if the characters themselves acknowledge that not having geysers is maybe a rarity, but also a problem, then that will indicate to the player who is attentive that, it's actually a good idea to play for geysers and look for geysers and try to expand towards them. And then, we'll have dialogue about the treasury. When you scout out a resource depot or something, you can think to yourself oh shit, I should probably grab a treasury. You wouldn't have that instinct as a player because you would just see a spot and think, I have to build a fucking ministry. I mean, you'd think command center probably because you're new, but you'd think something like that. And then, having some dialogue that mentions if I were you, I'd drop a treasury down there or something. Or maybe even your protagonist simply says, yeah, I should get a treasury set up over there. Or that looks like the perfect spot for a treasury or something like that. And that'll be enough, right? For there to be dialogue that isn't really super handholdy. It makes sense in universe. It's handholdy in a way that I hope is not seen as disrespectful. But again, if you're playing the tutorial, but you've already been playing the project for years, you probably don't need some of that dialogue. So I would understand why those people would just seem a little bit disinterested. However, it's a great opportunity, I think, for once we have this kind of tutorial content to start reaching out to people who maybe have friends or even family members. I know Luciferius was playing it with his brother recently, which is pretty epic. The Shambler set up his, I think his grandfather with it in the Butcher's Ballad campaign, which I thought was amazing to hear that there was this 90-minute mission that went down with, back then they were still called ion cannons, but the diadems and, ridiculous stuff like that, where they were just I just imagine an old man with 20 APM absolutely laughing hysterically at how ridiculous the game state is and how much better it is or whatever. Because that's what the Shambler told me was happening. Maybe not hysteric laughter, but some laughter, some chuckles, some this is so much better, something like that. So warms my heart, warms the cockles of my heart. By the way, why is cockles a word, dude? Seriously? Come on, English. You can do better. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm pretty happy with the idea of reaching out to some people who don't necessarily know what's going on as far as that is concerned. And, haven't played too much. Maybe they've heard you specifically talk about it and you've tried to get them into it and it just looked a little dense or intimidating or whatever. Maybe the tutorial's enough to swing their idea. Maybe they can get into it then. So that would be one example. And they can also give us some pretty valuable feedback for I was still confused about X thing. And then I have to consider, okay, is, thing X something that I should account for in the script or the general flow of things? Or should I just say, well, that's pretty outlandish, and I don't think most people are going to be confused about that. I am assuming that because it's a mod, people have played Brood War before. I mean, Brood War is also a really old game and very popular, so I think you can safely assume that anybody downloading a large-scale RTS mod has probably played Brood War before, even if they don't play it frequently. So my thought process is that I'm targeting players who don't know that much about CMBW specifically, but are interested in it, and players who are probably a little bit on the weaker side mechanistically with these tutorials, right? But we'll see, you know, even if you had pretty good mechanics, like I would love to brain wipe Connor or Mystery Meat or something and then sit them down here because they've got reasonable mechanics, you know, Shambler too, you know, or even myself, but don't brain wipe me. Obviously, I'm the fucking principal developer, so that wouldn't be a good idea. I'd love to brain wipe somebody who has reasonable mechanics and like, you know, places highly in the tournaments that we have right now, and then sit them down and say, all right, dude, learn this mod and see what happens. Because I actually think that even somebody of it's bold for me to say this about Connor because he's very well-rounded and fairly good at macro in particular. But I feel like if I set somebody like him down, he might lose to the first mission of the tutorial if he has no idea what's happening. He might lose at least once, is my thinking. And then, you know, he'd start to realize, oh shit, you know. I think I'd give him one grace loss. I think he would lose once and then he would absolutely smash. But that's the kind of thing, you know, it's like really interesting in a sense. So, yeah, we'll see how that goes. We'll see how successful that is. I imagine some of the weaker players will probably have to replay the tutorial a few times before we properly ship out the tutorial, like on the release branch or whatever. We will test it on pre-release, just like everything else. And I will also be looking to develop a bank data system with the help of Veek, ideally, because I don't really know where I would even start for that. And what we will try to accomplish with this is the opportunity to save progress in the dialogue department so that we can skip certain transmissions that are pure handhold first time only. Like if you have played the map like yesterday, or even like you just played and lost, so you restarted. I don't want you to hear the full intro again, and the in-game intro that is. And I also don't want you to hear like, what would you say? There's certain dialogue events that are going to be, you know, about the geyser, for example. You probably don't need to hear that a second time because you already heard it the first time. So I don't want people to get jaded from the constant badgering of the transmissions. And that can very easily happen. I mean, jaded might be the wrong word, but they just be annoyed. It's like miffed. It's like, really, I have to listen to this again. Now, you can just hit the escape key. So it's not the end of the world. But for people who don't know that you can hit the escape key to skip a dialogue event, that is going to be awkward for them. So they would probably just get slightly miffed. Now, if we just have a bank data thing that when you quit the mission or you are defeated or even victorious, you like that data gets saved, and then we read that data to determine whether or not to replay those dialogue events, I think that's going to be enough. And then obviously we would need some sort of some kind of mechanism to clear the bank data without having to go in and find the file that it corresponds to and delete it. Because it will just create a text file or whatever in the map directory. So I think that will be fine. And then I guess it won't be a pure text file because we had it in technically we do have the bank system already implemented. It's just done through AI scripts. It's really inconvenient to use. And that system uses a binary file because I was concerned. I had iCore implement it as a binary file so that people couldn't just like easily change fields in it to be like, hey, I won or something. I don't know, like I performed super well. I don't think that there's going to be anything like that in these bank datas though. So I don't know if we would actually need that. We might start with the plain text system and then change it over later on as like serialized data or something. Anyway, the point is I would really like to have that work out just fine. And we'll have to wait and see about that. However, aside from that, there's a pretty big deal where I would like to have working bank data for the release version of these tutorials. And yeah, I mean, I think the first one for the Terran will be done in the next few days as far as like a pre-release testing. The only thing I need to do is triggers and voice acting and stuff for the dialogue. And then it'll be ready in a bare bones way where there's all like trial run dialogue, trial run voice acting for all the transmissions and stuff. It'll probably all be me at first. So if you decide to play it and help out with the testing, then you'll have to take note of that. But that's the current planning for the tutorials, basically. The first mission should be available soon. The second mission I've not even started, nor do I have planning for it. Like I said, I think I'm going to jump to the Zerg tutorial and make a tutorial for that. So just one mission for that, and then we'll sort of like drip feed them in afterwards. I'll probably go back to working on Day of Blood at some point before continuing the a massive amount of the tutorial thing. And like I said, it might be worthwhile to make a Protoss tutorial that is in the same vein as the Terran and Zerg ones. And they just end up working out as like single maps for now. And the Protoss one is destined to be updated whenever the warp field stabilized stuff that we talked about in the last episode, right? The overhaul for the macro is completed, because I don't know if that's actually that easy. So, if we make significant progress on the Protoss stuff before the Zerg tutorial is finished, then I'll probably just be like, well, let me hold off on doing anything crazy, and we'll just finish out that. But if it's not, if we don't have significant progress done with the AI stuff and etc., I will most likely end up just being like, okay, let's work through the, let's just make like a bare bones Protoss tutorial that like helps introduce people to things, and we'll see about that. Like, that'll be what we do. So that's the current plan. Now let's talk about the coffee questions. Yes, that's right. It's coffee question time. If you like this episode of Prototype, if you like this show in general, if you like Cosmonarchy Brood War, if you like the No Frauds Club, if you like me, if you like Veek, if you like you, if you like 3, well, you can part ways with your hard-earned 3s by going to ko-fi.com/chronogo and Veek7. Link in the description. And you can pledge $3 or more a month. And once you do that, you get access to a question. So let's talk about these questions. The first up is 3Crow. He asks, could structure death animations be improved? And he specifically wanted to know if the structure death animations could be made longer and more noticeable without negatively impacting gameplay. And I had a thought about this, and it kind of reminded me about the Five Nations death animations, which are a lot more noisy than they probably should be, especially the final explosion, and particularly since their carcasses explode very radically, like 30 seconds after they actually die. So that's a little bit weird. But the other thing that it got me thinking of is, what if you implemented something like what Five Nations did, but you made it a lot snappier and a lot less noisy? However, it was still, an extra 5 seconds or something, or maybe 3 seconds or 2 seconds even, or whatever. The point is, what if you showed the structure actually crumbling, and during which time it was still providing collision, and thus you would have this like grace period of larger structures, where the larger the structure is, the longer it takes to actually blow up. And that would allow you to there'd be like this minor element of defender's advantage, where the structure would start to detonate, and rather than instantly being able to walk through it, while it's like detonating, it would still block collision during that time. And I don't think that would negatively impact gameplay. I think that would actually be an interesting thing to explore. It technically could be achieved within CMBW. I might even explore some kind of weird experimental thing to do that with, where I just add like a built-in delay for specifically for structures, and that's before I actually call like the unit death thing or whatever, and then we have some sort of modded in way of overlaying certain detonation effects or whatever. If I had full control, a second follow-up part of this question is, what would I actually see them as far as if I had like full control of being able to do it, if I could just snap my fingers and change it. I would almost certainly explore a series of explosions, and if you're talking about infinite budget, having individual like customized animations for each structure where like pieces start to fall apart and like the structure collapses. I think Age of Empires Definitive Edition for the first game did this. Maybe all of the games did this. Yeah, maybe the second game as well. Had like bespoke collapsing environments or whatever. I think they probably just like simulated it in 3D, but then like rendered it down into 2D and stuff. I would basically do something like that. Except for like some of them would obviously die in very different ways. There'd be loads of blood for the Zerg ones, of course. There would be loads of, like the Protoss ones would probably collapse, and like maybe a warp matrix for certain ones, like particularly for the production facilities, would probably suck in some of the pieces. I think that sort of happens in StarCraft 2 when you destroy certain structures, but I honestly can't remember. Maybe I'm fabricating that. I feel like it does. There, obviously, the particle effects in that game are not very readable or good, but that's not a bad idea conceptually, because like if it's supposed to be this warp anchor where you can, warp in units, and it says you're warping in like a zealot or something, maybe I'm thinking specifically of the warp gate when it's deployed. I think like pieces of it fly into the hole and stuff. So yeah, you might have something like that for all the production facilities where like a bunch of pieces are scattered onto the ground and turned into the rubble, but then a bunch of other pieces end up disappearing. And you could definitely have stuff like that happen in general. So that would be one thing to think about. And for Terran things, I think you'd just have the general explosions leaving holes in the structure and then it collapsing afterwards. So each race would have their own like archetype for what the death animations would be. And the only gameplay change again would be while it's doing this relatively, bombastic, you could say, death animation, and smaller structures would have less bombastic death animations by necessity. It's also blocking collision during that time. Therefore, that's the only gameplay change really. But you get this almost like slight ceremony, I guess. I mean, I don't want to use terms that are like co-opted by marketers for fucking loot crates, but like you get this, right now they do die relatively unceremoniously. And I think you could give a little bit more of like this pomp and circumstance to a momentous occasion of sniping a town center or, picking off a high value production structure or a tech center. I mean, imagine a tech center. That would be like, we would definitely have something like for the Zerg one, maybe it like really heavily shutters and takes a while to fully detonate just to like let it sink in that you actually did just lose that structure. That could be really cool. And then obviously for the Zerg ones as well, I mean, you would have regression, like ideally the regression would actually be animated. So this would go for the units too, I guess, but like for the structures, you would see the like the Kagran colony would like the Circuit colony would like pieces of it would start to detonate or blow off or whatever, and then you would reveal the Kagran colony that created it, right? You could think of this more clearly with the Larvos colony because it's a kit bash, and you could imagine the Larvos, or these are Cesians, not colonies now, excuse me. The Larvos Cesian would basically, you could imagine that like there's like a bleeding, slopping effect where like maybe it was almost like cut off or something, where like the top part of it starts to slide off and fall to the ground and leaves like a bunch of blood, and then there's like whatever, and then you see this regression in action. And I think that would be really neat anyway. So I guess this would also want to be paired with destruction animations or whatever. Instead of having just the fires, you would actually have like a wrecked render of the graphic where it's actually been through the ringer as far as like destruction effects go or whatever. So that would be paired with that. Just having a little bit more in terms of visual inclination of like how close is this structure to being destroyed. Relatively speaking, where are we as far as the breakpoints are? Like when you see it actively change, like, oh, you just went from 75% to 50% in that breakpoint, or you just hit 50% health or something. So yeah, just better and more interesting visual communication. And a slight change to gameplay in that defender's advantage is probably still there because the structure holds out a little bit longer for a wall or what have you. Although you can also use this against your opponent if you've got better positioning or something and you're in their base using their structures against them or something like that. I guess projectiles would have to penetrate no matter what. So this wouldn't affect Cyprians where like, oh, the stockade is still alive and it has enough armor to block the Cyprian shot. Ergo, while it's being destroyed and like in its death animation, the Cyprian shots will be blocked. I don't think that particular part would be the case, but anyway, this is all just like an interesting aside. We don't have the manpower to do this kind of thing, but I do think that maybe we can investigate like a lo-fi solution anyway that does the gameplay impact part, because I'm kind of curious about how that would work out, but it's not anywhere close to being on the horizon for me right now personally. So thanks for your question. Let's jump into Alexhandr's question. He asks, what kind of superweapon does Zerg have? And he gives like examples of how the Terrans have the obviously like some of the late tier air, but also most notably the Morning Stars, right? The anvils, the missiles, and how Protoss obviously have the glassing, and I would add like Tyranny and stuff, Tyranny of the Sun as a cornerstone. Well, my short answer to him, even in the channel, was the Sovroleth is the super weapon of the Zerg, and if you know, you know, because those things are fucking terrifying. A tier 3 swarm unit that constantly reinforces itself by harvesting corpses of fallen enemies, or allies for that matter, is a pretty terrifying thing to see, and also quite powerful. It also gains range but loses movement speed based on how many other Sovroleths are in the area. So what you imagine based on that is allied Sovroleths enchant individual Sovroleths. So like basically as it flocks around and as more of them get concentrated into a single area, which is especially possible when you're, consuming corpses and stuff, it does basically result in this really interesting effect where the unit becomes like a multitude, right? It becomes like an organ that is made up of all of the individual cells, right? Because the Sovroleth, like individually, they gain range, but they lose movement speed, so they start moving much more tightly packed together, which is really interesting as far as like how the gameplay effect ends up working out. It was an experimental thing, but I really like how it turned out. So that is definitely a super weapon. Infestation is going to be if you want to call it a super weapon, it's going to be something like that, insofar as you can really heavily, like it's going to be a very powerful cornerstone, basically. But I don't know if it's like a concentrated power into one kind of unit type of deal, which is what the Sovroleth is. If they were going to have something like that, I mean, Carapace Swarm is still very powerful, but it's a tier 3 unit, right? The Estratholeth, so we don't see it too often. And I think right now that's probably everything. The Alcagelisk will be receiving some updates at some point, and we will try to make it feel a little bit more powerful. I don't know if it'll be super weapon level, but it should be pretty neat. And I think the other example he gave for Protoss was the Anthelion as well. Yeah, basically the Monument of Sin is a pretty super weapon type structure right there. Myrian asks, how do you go about creating factions and the world they inhabit? What is your inspiration? I think this was initially going to be intended for general comment, and then he specifically said when I asked him, "Oh, do you think like I guess I'll ask specifically about Cosmonarchy Brood War," but I'll try to answer generally because I think a lot of it is the same. Like, yes, in Cosmonarchy Brood War, I'm technically working with a pre-existing material, but I really don't like a lot of the pre-existing material. So, obviously, I'm not starting from pure scratch like I am for something like Xibalba and for Onatar and for Pangea and all this other stuff. However, in a way, like, yes, that is easier because there's some stuff that I already have to work with. And in another way, it's not exactly easier because I have to undo a lot of damage dealt by the original authors. So there's a decent amount of like give and take there. And I think I definitely would be would rather be able to work on my own shit completely. But, you know, time will tell all tales. Big sip of water. I think if I'm going to answer Myrian's question completely, I would have to talk about how even with my work within Cosmonarchy Brood War, Terran, Zerg, and Protoss feel very different to how they did in the original game. Especially Protoss, I think, because they're presented as really dumb people that are just going to go ahead and immediately devolve into religious infighting instead of trying to solve actual problems on their homeworld. Yet they are supposed to be, like, at once very enlightened beings, and at the same time heavily against the Zerg and heavily like opposed to them existing. And yet their homeworld has them, and they're still going out and trying to catch traitors. And so it just doesn't make any sense. That one thing ruins the Protoss. Before you even get into anything else that's also stupid that they also do, that one decision where Aldaris decides, I'm going to send valuable warbands away from the Protoss homeworld while Zerg are touching it, and I am going to send them to arrest some guy. Like, I don't really care what that guy did. I mean, unless he's somehow connected to the Zerg overwhelming ire, there is absolutely no reason to do this. This is such a boneheaded move that just from that one act alone, they become absolutely impossible to take seriously. And that's before you get into everything else that they do later on in the campaign and later on in Brood War and etc. So, yeah, very dumb. That being said, I think that there's loads of potential with their concepts. I'm also stripping out a bunch of stuff that I don't like and adding a bunch of stuff that I do like. So they aren't exactly Brood War era, you know, StarCraft. They're not the same thing, right? Obviously, it's just fan fiction at the end of the day because I can't look at that and say that's mine. But I can at least look at it and present to you guys what I believe is a much better alternative. So in that context, I definitely am trying to imagine. Well, I mean, it sounds trite to say, but I am trying to imagine what would people actually do. If I'm this elevated form, what might I do? I try to put myself in their shoes. If I'm some, you know, otherworldly hive mind, what might I do? And what might we do, I guess, because, you know, it's a hive mind. What might the collective do? If I'm thinking from that perspective, you know, what could be possible? And to a degree, there's always going to be some folly in that because you're human. So you can't really understand something that's not human, but you can understand it as it pertains to being human. You can understand the ways that it's different than a human. I think that helps a lot. When I'm building something like Xibalba, when I'm trying to understand what is going on and what kinds of decisions might be made, that is actually a pretty big, important lens to keep in mind. You've got this context of, hey, I'm supposed to be writing from the perspective of something that is not human. If you can apply this lens of, I am human, but this thing is not human, and the ways that it differs from humans are in these ways. As such, what might that, change about an action that makes sense to a human? What might that change about what would make sense to that thing? Like, would a human's action make sense? Or would there be some other play to take? And you really do have to think about this to some degree, and maybe I just have a knack for it because I've been doing it so long, but that's definitely the main thing that I would look at and say, yeah, creating factions, creating worlds, particularly in sci-fi and fantasy where there is no, like, not everybody is human, not everybody is human-like, not everybody can be related to being a human. That sort of approach, I think, is super interesting. It's definitely what I like most about sci-fi, at least superficially. Like, there's loads of subtle things that you could get into that are really cool and definitely could involve humans. And I think it's not a problem if you have humans in your setting. I know some people feel like you should either only have humans or not have any humans. And obviously, I've had only humans in Pangea, and I've had no humans in Xibalba, so I'm fine with either approach. Although, it's kind of a cop-out to say that I've had only humans in Pangea, because that's sort of like saying there are only humans in Dune, but obviously in the Dune setting, there's like loads of different things that are, like, they might as well be different races, especially genetically. So really depends on what you come up with, right? You obviously always want different factions. So I create the factions by thinking, the world is a very big informant in this, because you have to think to yourself, what is unique about this world? What is unique about this setting? Are there going to be things which, really modify how you approach certain characterization or certain things? And in Xibalba, it's that there's loads of different alien species, and a lot of them are spacefaring and capable of fighting massive wars, and none of them are small in terms of their total population. So they all represent a pretty significant threat or, effect or whatever. They all have power. What does that do? Like, that is a unique aspect of the setting. Dude, a truck just honked at me and totally broke my train of thought. Where was I? I think, realistically, the most important aspect of any sort of somebody who's trying to create factions or races, or I think factions is probably a good word, because it's kind of, it's agnostic to whether or not you have like distinct races, or is it like Dune, right? As another, going back to that example, where there's just different houses and different, like, political powers and stuff. They all need some kind of, it's kind of like characters, but at a macro level, which is pretty cool because that's exactly what it is. But the mechanics work the same. It's with characters, you want some sort of opposing conflict or some sort of reason for them to cooperate if they're going to be on the allied side, and distinct goals. And some of them are going to be, in unison. Some of them are going to be at odds. So you kind of want to do the same thing with factions. And this goes for, factions within a single, say, RTS race, or factions as the races, like conceptualizing them as the races. It's all the same way. So the world does dictate that, because I was giving the example of the Xibalba races, where there's so many different things that you have to watch out for, and some of it's conventional, and some of it's cosmic horror stuff, and some of it's somewhere in between, and some of it's super technological, and, a lot of it is going to be very different, but there's going to be some through lines. So to how different are they to humans, right? To go back to that thought process for like that lens of like writing dialogue or making decisions about characters, or, deciding how a faction is going to conduct themselves. And, believability is a big part of that. How do you make it believable? Well, you don't want to stray too far into the realm of drama, but well, to the degree that you do that, you want to earn it, basically, right? And so Brood War didn't earn it in its plot because it had, like, this characterization of Protoss, for example, but then they, like, basically commit suicide at a genetic level by ignoring their homeworld being ravaged by mortal enemies, and go off to, steal some guy back and arrest him and stuff. It's like, that's really silly. So you obviously don't want something like that, where you don't earn some sort of reason for them to risk their homeworld for one guy that obviously did not do very well by them or whatever. They feel affronted and offended and all this other stuff. But it's not just that. It's like, okay, but read the room, like consider the context. So you obviously want to make sure your factions make believable decisions. So when I was talking, actually Myrian was present for this, when I was developing the first mission of Day of Blood, one of the things that I mentioned is I don't want players to think that the Orion Imperium is some cartoon villain, like Saturday morning cartoon stuff or whatever, where they're just like comically evil, similar to how like the Confederacy or the Dominion are portrayed within StarCraft, and be it StarCraft 1 or StarCraft 2 respectively. It's like, I don't want them to be that way. I want it to be ambiguous. Like the Galactic Empire in Star Wars is another example of this. Like, I think it was on Andor or in some show that I haven't watched or whatever. People say it's good. One of the things that they say about that's good is the world building, because they talk about how life under the Empire isn't all terrible. Like, they bring order, they bring stability. Well, the Orion Imperium is very similar in CMBW. It's, yeah, they're gonna bring with them some element of like you're guaranteed to be protected. So only under pretty extreme circumstances are you ever going to see, rebellions take place where there's some sort of insurrection that happens and you want to then take control for yourself. Maybe it's been a long time since, pirates have been sighted in here, or maybe they believe they can hold them at bay themselves, or maybe the pirates are even involved in the insurrection and then they promise to become like loyal citizens or whatever, law-abiding citizens. Who knows? Like, there's so many different things that could happen where you could conceivably see an insurrection occurring, but it would have to be somewhat extreme in terms of circumstances, right? It doesn't happen all the time. They're not putting out fires constantly across the entire galaxy. Like, to some degree they are, but not to the point where, they're losing colonies because to rebels or insurrections or whatever. And the other thing that I used is this, this idea that the upstarts in Day of Blood that you play as are also being funded by an external, syndicate, some sort of enemy of the Orion Imperium. Another one of the factions of the world. And I believe I settled currently on the Futurist Federation. I'm pretty sure that's what I'm going to go with. So that's interesting just in and of itself, because suddenly now you're dealing with agent provocateurs being, from foreign lands, from hostile governments. And that's really interesting because that's how they would wage war, because the Orion Imperium is so vast they can squash any individual threat as long as it's presenting enough of a threat to warrant such a massive reaction. But, that's not what you're going to see exactly out of the Orion Imperium if the enemies play their cards right, or if indeed the threats are genuinely smaller. And then, of course, one thing leads to another. Zerg happened to attack this colony. Is there some sort of coincidence? Well, maybe not. So, like, that's something that we got to explore in the narrative. That's something the players got to explore by paying attention. So that's like one example, right? Of me thinking, you're far away from the original lore. You don't have to worry about that. What happens? Well, here's a megalithic empire, right? This gigantic monolithic empire is what I meant to say, but obviously megalith empire is the name of a map I made, so that's why I confused those two. Here's this monolith of power, and they are very, very powerful, but they're not completely unchallenged. Maybe together, a coalition of all of the different other factions could oppose them somewhat formidably. However, they're definitely, they have a very powerful claim to the seat of power currently. So they're pretty potent within the setting. That doesn't mean that it's all sunshine and rainbows. What could be a case where a colony revolts, because that's what I need for the story. Like, that's what I'm deciding. So in a way, yes, I'm working backwards towards a plot, but in another way, it's like I conceptualize the plot as posing an interesting challenge of how can I get this without sacrificing the sanctity of the setting? How can I achieve an insurrection without making the Imperium look like a bunch of doofuses? And to the extent that they would still look silly, that would be a failure of my writing. Or maybe somebody just totally missing some sort of key detail. But assuming they were both in good faith in their criticism and correct with what they say, that would mean that my writing has failed. But you stand a much smaller chance of actually failing in that manner if you go about it from this perspective, from you trying to understand, how can everybody involved be reasonable? Like, unless there's a reason, which is funny to say, for a character or a faction to behave unreasonably, there needs to be some deference to, like, how does this make sense from their perspective? And that, I think, is the cornerstone of creating believable factions. As far as making them distinct, I feel like that's a separate conversation. But, generally speaking, if they didn't, the reasons why they are distinct are like meditations on what might be a successful way of organizing society, or, whatever. Like the Mackerel Das in Zabalba, I've described this before as they basically have an individual psychopathy where they all believe, like, maybe not necessarily delusions of grandeur, because they could back it up if given the opportunity. Many of them could anyway. They first have loyalty to themselves, and second to their people. So the idea is, like, they are self-serving to the bitter end. But the reason they don't just devolve into, I'm going to make sure that I'm the emperor of nothing, is because that's not self-serving, actually. And it's like, it's almost amusing, amusing. It's almost a meditation on would it be possible to have a society built of psychopaths? Like, would that be feasible? I'm not saying it's a good thing. I mean, they have fucking slaves and stuff, and I always say to people, well, not always anymore, but when I was working on them more frequently, I was just imagining the stink pieces, because this is back in like peak culture war territory. We're talking a couple of years back now, where people were talking about like any representation of slavery in like science fiction is like clearly white supremacist rhetoric or whatever. I was just imagining the stink pieces of like, oh my God, Pronogo must think that slavery is a good thing because Makral Das, he said they're one of his favorite races. He worked really hard on them, and yet they have slaves. It's like, yeah, buddy, they can be one of my favorites without, me thinking that they do a great job. I mean, they're also not fucking human, for one. So that also changes quite a bit. Anyway, the fact that they are totally like psychopathic in the way that they approach certain things doesn't mean that they're self-destructive, right? That's an interesting idea. Like, what happens if the psychopaths are like, if that's normal, and if like the mutation would be that you're not a psychopath, right? Like the 10% of people or whatever. Now, there's reason to believe that maybe that wouldn't happen evolutionarily speaking, like maybe that wouldn't be feasible. But I just like the idea that at the very least you have the predominantly psychopathic and maybe even narcissistic angle, but it's like, well, I don't want to be the emperor of fucking nothing, so therefore I'm going to make sure that I serve and do a good job under the current emperor. And under the current, like however many steps removed I am from claiming the throne, like whoever's my superior, I'm going to serve them as well as I can. I'm going to get valuable experience towards my own claim to a throne. I'm going to build valuable connections. Maybe I want to splinter off and start my own empire, which, that's just their term basically, but like their kingdom or whatever. Like, you could probably have very small kingdoms and then it just doesn't feel like, why, that's an empire? Like, I don't know if that's true, but like, whatever, like they want to start their own faction. Maybe they can, if they convince people that it would be better for them to leave the current one and go a different direction. They can also challenge the throne, usurp, try to, do political backstabbing and all this other stuff. And it's just kind of accepted. Like, they don't get offended by it. They feel like, oh, I should be better than you because I am better than you because I'm a psychopath or whatever. Like, they think that, like, they genuinely think that they're better or that they are destined for the throne in a context of like, they should be the one to do it. But they need to prove that. So it's like slightly self-aware psychopaths, I guess is the way to describe it. But like, that's going to be very different than the average human. Very, very different than the average human, just from that difference alone. Forget about the physiological differences of them being aquatic creatures and not being able to natively breathe air in the same way that, many carbon-based life forms in the universe can do. So when you're thinking of it in those terms, that also does significantly impact how decisions are made and how societies are organized, and therefore how the factions will be represented in the lore. And I really like having interesting ideas, following through on them enough to see what actually sticks and what was just, maybe rule of cool and then thus needs to be reshaped to be more, I guess, meaningful, right? Less just like surface level, more substantive, right? Less, veneer. And just really digging into that. And, some things may clash. It's going to be a challenge to make sure that conceptually and thematically, we're not like representing something that is, for example, you could very easily have a very serious tone, but then have this race or faction that's absolutely wacky and stupid. And then you could bungle that very easily because those are very difficult things to unify and to combine. I'm still not 100% convinced, for example, that like Iskatumesk, who's somebody who's done this for a very long time, combine the serious with the insane or the wacky. I don't know that I would be able to buy into a setting with that. Like, I haven't explored that too heavily. Like, I haven't been a player in his D&D campaigns or whatever. I don't know if I would like it. I don't know if I would jive with it. Like, to me, it seems like something you should probably best keep separate. That doesn't mean you can't have comic relief, but it just has to be fitting, right? And it can't be like the entire impetus for a faction to exist or whatever, in my opinion. Maybe you could play it off like these guys were a genetic mistake, but then they kept replicating. Like, maybe that's slightly amusing or, oh, that's a bit of a wacky premise. But it's not like, these guys are made of clown DNA or something. Like, whatever. What does that even mean? Like, that could be something that happens in a map crap or whatever. Like, that's the kind of thing that I'm not sure I'd be able to unify. So that's an extreme example, but you definitely want to make sure that you unify the themes to a degree that, like, at least they can coexist without raising eyebrows. That being said, that doesn't mean you should try against doing some really wacky concepts. I really like wacky concepts. I don't know if you guys knew, but I just have to make sure that the themes make sense. So hopefully that answered the question. Obviously, I got interrupted halfway through by a honk, because literal honk nation, which is a new emoji you can now use, courtesy of some stupid bot that is used by roller skates. So we equipped those roller skates, and now they are available for your use in the Discord server. Let's go to the final question of this episode. The Shambler asks, what is your favorite Cosmonarchy Brood War race, and why? What a good question, and a lovely casual one to answer before we close things out. I really have to think about this. I will tell you what I like about all of the races. I like that Terran is able to successfully be very, harassment oriented, survive contains, and be like defensive turtley. And that just feels like a natural evolution of the default Brood War style. I think that, like, again, I've said this before, but like the changes to liftoff and to deployables and to healing and all this other stuff made Terran more Terran. It feels like they do more of what they used to do. Yes, if we added more traps similar to the lobotomy mine, they'd probably feel even more Terran, because then you could have different kinds of mines or whatever. Or like a mixed set of mines or what have you. Like, that would be interesting. There's also the concept of, what else could you maybe try to experiment with? Like, obviously, the fact that we added the Morning Star, which used to be called the nuclear missile, that is an interesting idea. Like, oh, now the Seraph can use it, right? It's not just the Eidolon. So that's neat. Like, now you have different ways to do that. They are more Terran. They are more of what they were before, to a greater degree, right? And I always go back to this. It's the Supernova in the East series by Dan Carlin over on Hardcore History. You can check that out. I think it's on Spotify, for example. It's probably on YouTube as well. You can check that out. You can listen. One of his quotes is that there's like a description of the Japanese people at this era of time. And it's not his quote, but he quotes it as saying, the Japanese are like everyone else, only more so. Well, to my taste, Terran in CMBW are like Terran in Brood War, only more so, right? That's how I would describe them. So I definitely really like Terran. I really like their playstyle. I obviously love to harass and drop and be annoying. I like to do map control stuff with vultures. I like to set up defenses and generally have posts all over the place. I really like that aspect of them. For Protoss, I mean, obviously we've talked about how like the changes to their macro revision are going to really make them very interesting and refreshing. But generally, even in the current incarnation, I really like their tech flexibility. Obviously, it requires you to learn a lot of stuff, but I really like the fact that now that I've learned it and I have reps with it and I've been playing more often, you have a lot of options and you can customize your army to a very specific, peculiar degree, which sometimes can bite you in the ass if you have insufficient sets of say you have like, I'm going to try to do my best to use, all these different structures. Well, maybe you need one kind of unit type that's in another structure that you didn't make or whatever, and then you don't have enough build space, and you have to do all this awkward stuff. You can't relocate your base as freely as Terrans can, for example. That's something that I recognize as like maybe something that will be easily cleaned up when they have many fewer production facilities. But regardless, in their current format, despite their foibles, I really appreciate the tech flexibility. I think it's really cool that you can do so many interesting strategies. I definitely really like I always liked Protoss in Brood War. They were my favorite race. And the reason was nothing to do with like pro play or melee play. It was just, I really liked some of the ideas within them. And again, like I thought if I decided to reshape them fanfiction style, I could make them so much better, so much more focused, so much more believable. A lot of the stuff that I talked about in Myrian's answer, or Myrian's question, in the answer to Myrian's question, I think reflect my feeling that the Protoss could be so much better than they were. And that has definitely fueled my work on them, as both in terms of gameplay, where I try to like really focus in on a bunch of core themes to them, but also in terms of lore and presentation, which a lot of which is just in my head or on a page and not yet in a game where you can play it. So obviously we'll try to correct that record as quickly as possible. And for Zerg, I mean, I'm a big fan of swarming stuff. I'm a big fan of, I actually want to like explore adding Kagra, the creep, spreading that from units instead of just structures and stuff like that. Like maybe the Agrolith should get implemented sooner rather than later, as an example. I feel like there's loads of different things that you could try to do. And I especially really like the concept of, again, having this idea that you can assimilate or you can have the brood spawn and you can like raise the corpses, but as, like not what they used to be with the whole Apostle Lazarus Agent stuff or whatever, the reclamation for Terrans. It's really interesting to think about how epic Zerg can really be in a swarm state. So and it's probably no surprise that I think Zerg might be my best race in terms of performance, although Terran, if I'm in the right mood and I don't throw the game by trying to be super aggressive, I think Terran could probably be my actual right race. Like if I was in a competitive setting for, tournament play, then that would be really epic. So like, I think I would probably do pretty well as Terran as well. But anyway, despite that, if I had to pick currently, I would say Zerg are definitely more flexible in terms of different playstyles you can have than Terran. Like Terran, you have to almost be in the mood for a bit of a grind or longer game times or whatever, and that's fine. Like I do like that, as I said. And Protoss obviously have a lot of foibles that we're trying to correct with the macro revision, so I think it does have to default to Zerg. And in that sense, I am just like the Shambler, Alexhandr, and Fagudo as 3 people off the top of my head that I can name as Zerg is their favorite race. I think 3 Crow as well, actually, funnily enough. So there you go. That's my favorite race and why I like all of them and why you should play Cosmonarchy Brood War indirectly. So there you go. Some good marketing for you. And that will conclude the show. So I feel pretty good about the topics discussed. I feel really good about the pace where we're doing this once a week. We're getting the fan questions in, sort of making it worth their while. I mean, like they're donating once a week, or once a month, but they're getting this 4 times a month in theory if I do it once a week, on average, right? So that's pretty cool. And I guess as a closing announcement, or not really an announcement, but just something that I've been thinking about, I want to get back into the... I usually don't say I want to do X, I just do it and then tell you guys that I did it. But in this case, I figured I might as well say it publicly to maybe increase the likelihood that I hold myself accountable to do it. I want to get back into the Substack stuff. I think picking a topic that was discussed on this show, for example, like when I do an episode of Prototype, I always cover, 2, 3 big topics. I could easily just start writing maybe a small number of words on one of these topics and explain my thoughts on it or whatever, and that would be a Substack article. So I think I can get over that just by doing that. So that's my plan. That's my idea. And aside from that, look forward to Ascension 3 playoffs. Look forward to the Selection Extender coming to release after Ascension 3 playoffs. Look forward to Fraudarchy returning for a 6th of August play date, if you want to call it that, and Ascension 4 the week following. And look forward to the tutorials. Ideally, the Terran tutorial will drop in an early state in the next 4 days. So stay tuned and see you then.